DeAndis was a very sweet kid. The biggest smile, loved to laugh, just loved to have fun.
DeAndis wasn't raised in the streets, but he did get in trouble.
There is someone who had been shot. They're lying on the ground. There's a bunch of blood.
It doesn't look like he saw this coming. He was taken by surprise.
They told me, and it was just, I fell to my knees. I just couldn't believe it.
Who do you think would do that to DB? I don't know.
She lured DeAndis. She thought he was going to just confront him and maybe fight him.
Right now you look like a cold-blooded killer. You shoot this guy in the head and then drag him out of the car. No way in hell I was in that car.
This is a case about payback. It's a case about revenge, and it was an execution.
Knoxville, Tennessee is a college town nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains.
We have the University of Tennessee here, which is the major public flagship university of the University of Tennessee system. The Smoky Mountain National Forest, one of the most visited national parks in the country, is here close by to Knoxville.
It's Sunday, October 29th, 2017, just after 10:30 p.m., when the Knoxville Police Department receives a flurry of 911 calls.
Knox County 911. There is someone who had been shot. They're lying on the ground. There's a bunch of blood.
Police are dispatched to a neighborhood in South Knoxville.
That location's kind of a residential area, a place that's not associated typically with this kind of activity.
When officers arrive on scene, there's a victim laying in the road. There's blood everywhere.
The unidentified man appears lifeless, with an apparent gunshot wound to the head.
It was very clear that there was absolutely nothing they could do for this man, and he was pronounced dead at the scene.
One of the first things you want to do as an investigator on a scene like this is figure out who the victim is.
They bring out a small device. It's an integrated automatic fingerprint identification system. If he's been arrested previously, he's applied for professional license, been in the Army, those fingerprints are in that system.
They were able to get his identity through fingerprint identification there at the scene. It was a young man named DeAndis Billings, who was 27 years old at the time.
This is the first puzzle piece. We have a victim. How did all of this happen? What led to this?
Born in 1990, DeAndis Billings grew up in Knoxville with his mother, father, and siblings.
DeAndis was the baby, and he was spoiled rotten, and his daddy spoiled him, and I spoiled him to a certain extent.
DeAndis was a very sweet kid. The biggest smile, loved to laugh, just loved to have fun. And as he grew up, he was a sweet teenager.
DeAndis' teachers didn't always appreciate his sense of humor.
As a student, he always got in trouble all the time. I was at the school every time he turned around, class clowning and talking back, just anything, he got in trouble.
Being a class clown is one thing, but his family truly never imagined that he would be in trouble with the law.
But when DeAndis was still a teenager, he was convicted in connection with an armed robbery and sentenced to 5 years in prison. His family was stunned.
DeAndis wasn't raised in the streets, but he did get in trouble, and he had a visitor every week. Me and his dad would take turns. I would go 1 week, his dad would go 1 week.
So they made sure he constantly had visits. You know, he never felt alone.
DeAndis served his time and was released in 2014.
When he went to jail, he was a teenager. When he came home, he was an adult. So things are different now. Technology's different. Everything is different. So you have that adjustment period. So he's making the adjustment back to freedom, so to speak.
It did make him harden. He used to tell me, jail, it'll turn you a different kind of way, and it makes you hard, and you have to look out for yourself. He said, you sleep light.
While in prison, DeAndis made the best use of his time getting his GED, and when he got out, worked for a maintenance and repair company.
He was wanting to buy a house and start trying to flip the houses. That was his goal. He said, if I could get one house, I can start flipping them.
On June 17, 2017, DeAndis suffered a shocking loss when his best friend, J-Rock, was murdered.
J-Rock was DeAndis' best friend. J-Rock and DeAndis were real like brothers, really, really close. And J-Rock was murdered in a...
DeAndis took comfort in his family and in the arms of a new love interest, Zakia.
He did have a girlfriend, and he told me he was going to marry her. He said, Auntie, she's special. She's a school teacher. I said, she is. And he said, yeah.
When I seen him one day, he just had the biggest smile on his face, and he was really happy.
But on October 29th, just 3 months after the death of his best friend, 27-year-old DeAndis lies dead in the middle of a South Knoxville road. KPD detectives arrive on the scene.
No shell casings were found. There's a few personal effects, such as a hat and a cell phone case. No ID anywhere, no vehicle.
He had been shot 3 times in the head, and there were tread marks on him, left obviously by a vehicle.
It looked like the person who shot him pushed him out of the vehicle and maybe in their haste to leave the scene, ran over him.
They didn't find a vehicle that belonged to him, and they didn't find a vehicle that looked like it had damage from running over him.
With little physical evidence, detectives look for a witness.
You have to start knocking doors, canvassing the area, locating somebody who's seen something, heard something, or has a camera system. That is so important.
They happen upon someone who lives very close to the scene, and he has cameras. That individual cooperated. They pulled that video up immediately, and wow, it's all there.
The camera actually has the footage of the shooting.
In Knoxville, Tennessee, investigators are on the scene of a fatal shooting that claimed the life of 27-year-old DeAndis Billings.
Police spoke with a neighbor who lived down the street. His home had a video surveillance system. They're able to pull up the video.
The video is grainy, it's dark, but it still gives them some leads. It reveals some stunning images, quite frankly. It shows the headlights of a car coming down the road, and the car stops.
Moments later, there is a flash of light inside the car.
A muzzle flash occurs when the pin strikes the primer. There's an explosion of gases along with the temperatures, and the bullet is fired.
After one flash, the car slowly rolls forward. Then there are 2 other flashes. That's when the car jumps the curb and runs into a street sign.
A male jumps out of the rear passenger seat, runs around to the driver's side door, and pulls DeAndis Billings' body out, leaving him in the road.
The person got in the vehicle, got behind the wheel of the vehicle, and drove off, but not before putting that car in reverse and rolling over the body. They're able to tell what type of car it is from the video. That allows them to put out a be on the lookout for that particular vehicle, and they're able to get that out to other patrol officers in the area.
There's going to be a 2010 to 2011 black Nissan Altima. Tinted windows, factory wheels and tires. Black male driver. There'll be some blood and crime scene inside the car. It stopped tonight, so.
10-4 Bill Altino, Timbo, that.
After they wrap up at the crime scene, investigators pay a visit to Deondis' mother.
The doorbell rung, and my husband got up and went to the door, and I heard him saying, "Why you want to know what is it?" I kept hearing that, "What is it? What is it?" So I got up and I said, "What's going on?" That's when the detectives was there, and they told me, and it was just, I fell to my knees. I just couldn't believe it. And I asked them, are they sure? Was they sure that it was him? And they was like, yeah, we're sure. I just felt numb. I could not grasp that he has died.
Crystal is really upset, but they have to talk to her because she might have valuable information that can help them identify the shooter.
She told them that she was actually expecting her son that night, that he had told her he was going to come by, grab a plate, but he never showed up. When someone goes missing, or in this case worse, they go to those closest to that individual. And so detectives did ask Crystal if Deondis had a girlfriend, and they named Zakia. She owns a Nissan Maxima, and she would let Deondis drive it from time to time. It's the same kind of car that was seen in the video.
Detectives leave Crystal to follow up on the lead.
Detectives go out to Zakia's home and speak with her. They're not sure what her involvement is at that point.
Deondis' girlfriend tells investigators that he had borrowed her car about 6 or 7 at night to drive to his parents' house to pick up a plate. She talked to him around 9 p.m., and that was the last time that she heard from him. He didn't say where he was going or what he was doing.
After talking with her and her full cooperation, they realize she's not involved.
But now they can add that license plate to the Be on the Lookout so officers can look for that vehicle.
They enter the Nissan's information into NCIC, the National Crime Information Center. This notifies police that that vehicle was stolen and identified in a homicide.
Word of Deondis' death spreads quickly through the night.
I called my sister. My husband called his sister. It was just all night. We were still just in a state of shock.
The phone rang, and it was my sister, and I picked up the phone, and she screamed, "They killed Deondis." And I remember saying, "What?" And she said, "They killed Deondis." And I just started screaming. We got in the car, and my husband drove me to my sister's house. By this time, the house is full. His friends are there, family is there. Everybody's trying to figure out what happened, what's going on. My sister is totally devastated. She's just broken. She's broken.
I laid down and tried to sleep. I couldn't sleep. I just felt numb. I could not grasp that he has died.
Detectives aren't resting either. The morning after the shooting, they attend the autopsy.
What investigators learned is that Deondis was shot 3 times. Once to the right ear and twice around the right ear. And this simply confirms that Deondis was in the driver's seat, and whoever shot him was next to him, just like the video showed.
It doesn't look like he saw this coming. He was taken by surprise.
A few hours later, detectives get news they have been waiting for.
Around noon on Monday, the day after the shooting, police find that Maxima, and it's abandoned behind an apartment complex.
They can see that there's a blown out window, the door's ajar.
And detectives could see blood.
The morning after 27-year-old Deondis Billings was gunned down on a South Knoxville street, detectives have located a vehicle they believe was involved.
Zacchaeus Maxima was found abandoned behind an apartment complex on Knoxville's north side, about 15 minutes from where Deondis' body was found.
Detectives can see blood at first glance. It also appears someone tried to wipe down the car. Investigators find only 2 fingerprints. One is from Deondis, the other one is unidentified. Now the question is, who is this other person? This unidentified fingerprint can very well be the suspect.
Detectives then find 3 9mm shell casings. And there's something else that catches their eye.
There's a dishcloth wrapper with a barcode on it. So they immediately try to determine where this was purchased at. It might be a piece of key evidence.
The brand is one that's sold at a local grocery store. That grocery store is located less than a mile from where the vehicle was left abandoned.
Investigators head to the store, where they request surveillance footage for the hours around when the murder took place.
They were able to find a camera that catches her arriving at the store in a dark-colored Chrysler 200, and she appeared to be alone.
They pull the video up and they see a woman purchasing these exact same washcloths only about an hour after Deondis' shooting took place. In addition to the washcloths, they also see this woman buying bleach spray and some paper towels.
The woman who was making these purchases used her store loyalty card.
Police were able to connect the loyalty card to a local woman named Derasia. Armed with a picture of the woman, investigators go back to Deondis' mother's home.
He asked me, did I know this lady in this picture? And I said, she looked familiar, but I can't really tell.
She doesn't know, but there have been friends at the house gathering to comfort Crystal.
We showed the picture, and they right off the rip, they knew exactly who it was, what they called her and everything. This was Derasia.
Detectives make another connection between Derasia and the second fingerprint found in the Maxima.
They're able to use that unidentified print and compare it to Derasia's, and guess what? It came back as a match. She was in that car at some point.
But how did Derasia get from the Maxima to the Chrysler she was seen driving to the grocery store? That same day, investigators bring Derasia in for an interview. She quickly admits to knowing the victim.
Derasia tells investigators that she and Deondis are very good friends, that they hang out often, and she's adamant that she would never do anything to hurt Deondis, let alone kill him.
She immediately denies any involvement. She says she didn't have anything to do with it, she wasn't there.
Detectives confront Derasia with the store video.
The detective says, listen, I got you on video. You were there. I know that you helped clean it up.
The detectives lay it all out there for Derasia. They tell her that they've seen her on video buying the cleaning supplies and the washcloths. They see her using her Kroger card. Detectives then turn up the heat and appeal to her feelings for Deondis. They say, if you indeed loved Deondis, if he was really, truly your friend, you'll tell us who shot him.
She immediately says, I'll tell you, but I need your protection. Will you protect me?
Investigators in Knoxville, Tennessee are interviewing potential witness Derasia about the shooting of her friend, Deondis Billings.
Derasia finally agrees to talk, but not without assurances. She tells detectives in order to tell the truth, she has to be protected.
Derasia confirms she was with Deondis the night of the shooting.
She and Deondis were good friends, more like family, and she had just completed some very important job training and could not wait to share the news with him.
Derasia met up with Deondis at Deondis' mother's house. He was there to get a plate of dinner that night.
Deondis was driving Zakia's car, but he never went inside to get the plate. Instead, he asked Derasia to meet him there, and she jumped in the car with him.
Derasia wanted to ride around with him in his car and talk about her future, and she did that often with Deondis.
Deondis told her he was going to make a play. He had a deal that he was going to supply somebody with some drugs, and she was coming along.
Deondis wanted to stay on the straight and narrow and take care of his family, but he fell back into some of the criminal activity. Derasia said that that night he was going to meet this woman in the parking lot of a restaurant. When they got to the destination, the woman wasn't there.
Deondis sees someone walking across the parking lot, and it looks like Philip Locke.
Philip and Deondis knew each other because Philip was J-Rock's brother and Deondis was J-Rock's best friend in life.
J-Rock is Deondis' homeboy. He was killed in a drive-by shooting several months prior to this night. Derasia also knew Philip Locke, but she tells detectives she didn't know him well. She said she only met him the first time during J-Rock's funeral.
Philip then explains him and his girlfriend had gotten into a fight.
I need to get a ride. Can you give me a ride back to South Knoxville?
Deondis says no problem, and Philip hops in the backseat of the car. No big deal, that's his homeboy.
The conversation inside the car as the three occupants made it from East Knoxville to South Knoxville centered around J-Rock. Phil and Deondis were reminiscing about J-Rock.
When they get to South Knoxville, Philip points to a house and tells Deondis to pull over to the other side of the street. This is his girlfriend's house, but it looks like she isn't home.
Deondis pulled the car up to the side of the road. The conversation at that point was 100% reminiscing about J-Rock and how much they each missed J-Rock. They each pulled out their phones. They were showing each other video and photos of J-Rock.
Out of nowhere, Derasia says she hears a loud bang. It's a gunshot. She ducked down. And according to Derasia, Philip put his hand on her back and told her to stay down. She hears a second shot. Turns her head to the left and looks at Deondis. He has somehow put the car into drive.
Then there was a third shot. Derasia says the car hit a signpost. Then Philip jumped out of the car, ran around to the driver's side, and dragged Deondis out of the car, leaving him in the road.
Derasia was freaked out. She wanted to get out of the car, but Philip told her to stay in the car. He had a gun. She did what he said. As they drove off, Philip runs over the body of Deondis. Derasia at that point wanted to know, are you going to kill me too? He said no, and he let her live.
According to Derasia, Philip killed Deondis in retaliation for the death of his brother and Deondis' friend, J-Rock.
There was a suspect in J-Rock's death who was never arrested. Everyone on the streets believed that this man was responsible, but they were never able to prove it.
Philip thought Deondis and all those who knew his brother hadn't done enough.
Derasia tells detectives that Philip actually had a hit list of many others that he said would be dropping like flies because they didn't go after the suspect in J-Rock's murder. After Deondis was killed, Philip drove to a north side apartment complex where they abandoned the Maxima and got into a black Chrysler 200 that was parked. According to Derasia, Philip forced her at gunpoint to get in the car and ordered her to drive to the store for cleaning supplies. DeRasia was terrified of Philip. She obeyed what he said, and she went and bought the cleaning supplies, came back and gave them to him. Philip cleaned up the car. Once he was finished cleaning up the car, he went and dropped her off right back in front of Deondis' parents' house. DeAsia was in shock. She was too afraid to report anything to the police or tell Deondis' parents.
After the interview with DeRasia, investigators take a look at Philip's rap sheet.
Locke has a long record. We're talking about 7 felony convictions for robbery, attempted robbery, and cocaine possession with the intent to sell.
Philip Jerome Locke had been in prison and was on parole, had been on parole for about a few months in the summer of 2017.
Investigators get another key piece of evidence. Philip doesn't have a car, but they learn that his girlfriend, Shaniqua Robinson, does, and he often drives it. That car, a black Chrysler 200. The exact same kind of vehicle that DeRasia was seen driving in and out of the Kroger parking lot to buy the cleaning supplies. Detectives learn that Shaniqua Robinson lives in South Knoxville. When they go to the residence, they find the car parked outside of her home.
On Monday, October 31st, undercover officers keep watch on the home.
It was the middle of the daytime. They see Philip and his girlfriend leave the house and get into that vehicle, and the car pulls off.
Police follow the car. Shaniqua is behind the wheel. The car soon picks up speed. She gets on the highway, guns the engine, and takes off. This is indeed a high-speed chase.
2 days after Deondis Billings was gunned down and left for dead in the street. The Knoxville Police Department is embroiled in a high-speed chase with the #1 suspect, Philip Locke.
They have at least 2 people in the car. Philip Locke, a person of interest in the murder, and Locke's girlfriend, Shaniqua Robinson, who's driving. It's a lengthy pursuit, with speeds at one point reaching 90 miles per hour.
And in Lonsdale, they go up to this part at a dead end. And evidently, he didn't know it was a dead end, so they ended up dead ended and they blocked them off.
When the car finally stops, police order Philip and Shaniqua out of the car.
As Philip gets out of the car, an officer notices that he has something in his hand. He tossed whatever he had in his hand into the bushes. There's a struggle. Police ultimately tase Philip. After he's taken into police custody, they retrieve the object that he tossed. It ends up being a burner cell phone.
There's drugs in the car, a massive amount of drugs in the car.
He's on parole, and having this amount of drugs in the vehicle is a violation of parole, and Philip knows this, and he is very nervous at this point.
Police bring Philip and Shaniqua to the station for questioning.
At this point, Locke probably isn't sure why he's being interrogated. He's worried about his parole and about all those drugs that were found in his vehicle.
I'll tell you straight up what I'm looking at. I'm looking at you for a homicide, okay?
Then he asked him about Deondis, or DB, as he was known to his friends.
Have you heard about what happened to him?
Of course I heard about what happened to him.
Tell me about DB.
It's my brother's best friend. We all grew up together, but him and my brother was closer than anybody.
Would you consider him to be a friend of yours?
Of course, why not?
Okay.
The detective asks about the night of October 29th, when Deondis was killed.
Where were you that day?
Selling drugs.
Where were you selling drugs at?
Selling drugs everywhere.
He says he was alone that night, moving around town, selling drugs.
You don't think of myself. How do you think we do that to DB? I don't know. You have a lot of enemies?
We all do. I mean,
The two go back and forth. He had nothing to do with it. He had been in Deondas's car multiple times, different vehicles, but again, still no confession, didn't have anything to do with the murder. Why would he do that?
Then the detective tells Philip about the video.
Hey, mate, right now you look like a cold-blooded killer. You shoot this guy in the head and then drag him out of the car. And you're on video, bro. No way in hell I was in that car.
Philip is denying everything. Even after being confronted with the video surveillance, he's still denying everything. Investigators keep going after him.
You sent some girl into the Kroger's to buy all the to clean it up. She's driving your girlfriend's car. You screwed up. That's crazy.
Philip keeps the same composure, claiming his innocence, and he is indeed cooperative. He agrees to let police examine his iPhone, but his mood quickly changes when the detectives return with his burner phone.
I'm not gonna let you touch the phone because you're freaking me out.
I'm sorry for freaking you out. I don't want to go to jail.
I'm gonna write a search warrant for the phone.
While Philip was being questioned, so was his girlfriend in another room. And of course, she didn't know anything about the killing of Deondas, but says Philip struggled after the murder of his brother, J-Rock.
He, according to his girlfriend, had been deeply affected by the death of his younger brother. And over the course of the several months between July and October of 2017, Philip became frustrated and became anxious with the fact that his brother's death was not being avenged.
Investigators arrested both of them. Philip is being held for violating his parole. Shaniqua is being charged with felony evading arrest. Investigators need more to make the murder charge stick, and they hope that this burner phone that he was trying to ditch will be the key. Detectives wait to get a warrant and gain access to the phone's contents.
On that phone, they find internet searches for whether there were security cameras at a school near the murder scene and the apartment building where the car was abandoned.
But it's his text messages that are the most incriminating.
Investigators found an ominous text message. It was a text message from Phillips to someone named Cindy saying, "We're gonna get DB tonight, and you know I got you." Of course, investigators now have to find out who Cindy is. On November 3rd, detectives bring in Cindy for questioning. She admits to being a drug user. Philip offered to give her some crack in exchange for a favor.
Cindy was going to lure Deondas to a certain area in town. Philip was going to, by happenstance, be there. The plan came together on October 29th, 2017, when Cindy followed through with that ruse, and she contacted Deondas in an effort to get him to show up at a place in East Knoxville. Philip, meanwhile, had parked his car close by and was going to be on foot and was going to come up with a ruse that his girlfriend kicked him out and that he needed a ride back to her place in South Knoxville.
Cindy says that never in her wildest dreams did she think Philip would actually kill Deondas. She says she thought he was going to just confront him and maybe fight him, not murder him in cold blood.
Now, investigators finally have enough to charge him with murder, not just the parole violation.
On January 30th, 2018, Philip Locke is indicted on numerous criminal charges, including first-degree murder for the killing of Deondas Billings.
It felt like, thank you, Jesus, it's not going to be a cold case. We're going to know what happened and we're going to get justice.
On October 25th, 2021, nearly 4 years after Deondas Billings was shot to death, the trial of his accused killer, Philip Locke, gets underway.
This is about payback. This is about revenge, and it was an execution-style cold-blooded homicide for the purpose of avenging the death of Mr. Locke's brother, his younger brother who died some 4 months earlier in another cold-blooded homicide. Philip hatched the plan that he was going to start avenging the death of his brother by taking it out on those who he felt weren't taking matters into their hands. Specifically, Philip was looking for friends of J-Rock's who he believed had been consorting with and had been friendly to the person that he believed killed his brother.
DeRasia takes the stand and recounts the trip to meet up with Cindy for a drug deal. But that meetup was really a death trap designed by Philip Locke.
He formulated that plan by creating a ruse where he would be happenstance located at a place where Deondis Billings would be.
And Philip asks for a ride to his girlfriend's house. Deondis doesn't realize that he's in any sort of danger. This is his friend. He thinks he's doing a favor for a friend, so of course he says sure.
In actuality, there was no girlfriend there. It was an entire setup to get Deondis to come to that location or to drive him to that location for the purposes of executing him.
DeRasia had a front seat to the shooting, literally. She gets on that stand and tells the jury exactly what she saw, and that was Philip Locke pulling the trigger 3 times and ending Deondis' life.
Her testimony was impactful, it was emotional, it was something that a jury just couldn't ignore.
Cindy also takes the stand.
Cindy testifies that she didn't know she was helping Philip set up Deondis. But it was her who lured Deondis to a location under the guise of a drug deal. The state used GPS data from Deondis' cell phone to create a timeline of the night, corroborating DeRasia's account. There was also the burner phone he tried to ditch that had the messages to Cindy. The 911 calls, a security video from the crime scene, the Kroger store security video also add to the timeline and how Philip Locke orchestrated it all.
The trial lasted approximately a week. The jury took the case and came with a verdict back within a few hours. They found him guilty of first-degree murder with all of the circumstantial proof from the phone forensics and the forensics at the scene. The proof was overwhelming that Philip Locke had once again engaged in violent conduct, which is a pattern that he's had his whole life.
When we received the verdict, I feel a sense of relief. Justice is never really served because my nephew is gone. Nothing can bring him back. But at the same time, I wanted someone to be punished for taking his life, to have to serve time for taking his life.
In Tennessee, the judge does sentencing. In this particular case, he was sentenced to life in prison for the homicide of Deondis Billings.
Philip will have to serve 51 years in prison before being eligible for parole. And in addition to that, the judge tacked on another 30 years for his conviction on carjacking, robbery, and gun charges.
I was very happy. And he got 51 plus 30. And I was very happy.
He's going to regret the day that he ever pulled the trigger because he'll never get out.
With Philip behind bars, Deondis' family is left to grapple with their grief.
I'm just now grasping that my child is gone. I know he was gone all along, but
March 16th, 1946. The last traces of winter still clung to the Niagara Escarpment above Hamilton, Canada. The snow had begun to surrender to the first hesitant signs of spring, leaving behind a landscape of wet earth, scattered patches of ice, and bare trees whose branches looked like black veins stretching into a gray afternoon sky. Nothing about that day seemed extraordinary. The wind drifted lazily through the hills. Crows circled high above the limestone cliffs. Somewhere in the distance, factory whistles echoed across the city, reminding everyone that Hamilton was a town built on steel, smoke, and hard work. It was the kind of Saturday where children disappeared outdoors for hours without anyone worrying too much. 5 neighborhood boys wandered along narrow trails that twisted through the escarpment. Their boots slipped over damp rocks as they searched for anything interesting: a bird's nest, an abandoned bottle, perhaps an old military relic left behind after the war that had only recently come to an end. The world was trying to convince itself that peace had finally arrived. Families were rebuilding. Soldiers were returning home. Factories that had once produced weapons now manufactured the tools of ordinary life. People wanted desperately to believe that the worst horrors belonged to Europe, not to quiet neighborhoods in Ontario. Then one of the boys stopped. At first, it was nothing more than a shape lying several yards away, partially hidden beneath tangled brush. It looked unnatural against the pale ground, but from that distance, it could have been anything. An old sack. A discarded hunting trophy. Perhaps even the remains of a large animal. Curiosity drew them closer. The smell reached them before understanding did. It wasn't the sharp odor of fresh death. Weeks had already passed. Instead, it was heavy, sweet, and sickening, carried gently by the damp afternoon air. The boys hesitated. One stepped forward while the others remained behind. He leaned over. The world seemed to stop breathing. What lay before him was not an animal. Not a mannequin. Not some cruel prank. It was the torso of a man. No head. No arms. No legs. Just a human body, abandoned on a lonely hillside as though whoever had left it believed the forest itself would erase the evidence. The children fled in blind panic. Branches slapped against their faces. Their lungs burned. They stumbled over roots and rocks, desperate to outrun an image that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Within hours, police officers climbed the same trail carrying notebooks, cameras, and questions they had no hope of answering that afternoon. Seasoned investigators had witnessed murder before. Some had seen the aftermath of wartime violence. Yet even among experienced detectives, silence settled over the scene. Bodies told stories. This one had been robbed of its voice. The cuts were deliberate. Clean enough to suggest patience. Precise enough to suggest purpose. Whoever had done this had not acted in a blind explosion of rage. Every missing piece raised another question. Every unanswered question hinted at planning rather than panic. There was no face to identify. No fingerprints. No obvious clothing. Almost nothing that could immediately tell investigators who this man had been while he was alive. Only a torso. Only silence. As photographers documented every inch of the hillside, detectives began looking beyond the body itself. The grass. The disturbed soil. The angle at which the remains had been placed. The absence of large pools of blood. One detail became obvious almost immediately. The murder had not happened there. The hillside was merely the final chapter. The real story had unfolded somewhere else. Somewhere hidden. Somewhere cleaned. Somewhere a killer had believed no one would ever connect the dots. The newspapers would soon call it one of the most horrifying discoveries in Canadian history. Headlines screamed about the mysterious torso. Rumors spread faster than facts. Every cafe, barbershop, and factory lunchroom became an unofficial courtroom where ordinary people debated impossible questions. Who could do something like this? Was the killer still walking freely through Hamilton? Could a stranger be hunting again? Or had someone committed an act so deeply personal that destroying the victim's identity seemed as important as taking his life? Fear grows in the spaces left empty by certainty. Hamilton was learning that lesson one conversation at a time. Parents called their children home before sunset. Doors that had once remained unlocked were now bolted. Neighbors studied unfamiliar faces a little longer than usual. Every unexplained sound outside after dark suddenly demanded attention. Yet what frightened people most was not simply the brutality. It was the absence of explanation. Violence often arrives carrying a motive. Jealousy. Greed. revenge, anger. But this looked almost theatrical. A body dismantled with chilling precision. Pieces removed forever. An identity erased. It felt less like murder and more like a message. Except no one knew who was supposed to receive it. Weeks would pass before investigators managed to place a name upon the dead. By then, the mystery would only become darker. Because behind the victim stood a marriage already collapsing under secrets. Behind that marriage stood another relationship hidden from public view. Behind every witness stood conflicting stories. And behind nearly every answer waited another contradiction. Long before a courtroom would fill with reporters. Long before photographers crowded outside courthouse doors. Long before newspapers transformed one woman into the most infamous figure in post-war Canada. There was only a lonely hillside. A body without a face. 5 frightened children. And a question that refused to disappear. How do you solve a murder when someone has tried to erase not only the victim, but the very possibility of recognition? Some crimes reveal themselves immediately. Others hide behind lies. This one hid behind missing pieces. Every missing piece demanded imagination from investigators, patience from forensic experts, and courage from those forced to revisit memories they wished they could forget. As Canada slowly emerged from the shadow of the Second World War, another battle was about to begin, not on distant battlefields, but inside interrogation rooms, forensic laboratories, crowded courtrooms, and the minds of detectives chasing a truth that always seemed just beyond reach. The name Evelyn Dick would eventually become inseparable from this case. To some, she was a manipulative woman capable of extraordinary deception. To others, she became the center of a prosecution built as much on suspicion and public outrage as on undeniable proof. History has never completely settled the argument. Even today, nearly 80 years later, one haunting truth remains untouched by time. Someone killed John Dick. Someone carefully dismembered his body. Someone carried those remains into the hills overlooking Hamilton. And somewhere between the missing head, the missing hands, the missing feet, and the countless unanswered questions, the full story vanished into history. The city of Hamilton in 1946 stood at the edge of 2 different worlds. One looked toward the future with cautious optimism, believing the darkest years had finally been left behind. The other remained haunted by memories that refused to disappear, carrying invisible scars left by a war that had reached across oceans and touched nearly every family in Canada. Steel mills continued to breathe fire into the sky, freight trains rolled steadily through the industrial heart of the city, and workers filled the streets before sunrise, lunch pails swinging from tired hands. Life appeared to be moving forward, yet beneath the rhythm of ordinary routines lingered an unmistakable sense that peace did not automatically erase pain. Hamilton had earned its reputation as one of Canada's industrial giants. Smoke drifted endlessly from towering chimneys, settling over neighborhoods like a gray blanket that softened the outlines of brick buildings and church steeples. The air often carried the scent of coal, iron, machine oil, and damp earth. For many residents, those smells represented security. The factories meant jobs, wages, and the promise that families who had endured years of uncertainty could finally rebuild their lives. Entire communities revolved around the changing shifts at the steel plants. Fathers left home before dawn while mothers kept households running with remarkable resilience. Children walked to school beneath skies streaked with industrial haze, thinking little of it because they had never known anything different. Neighbors borrowed sugar from one another, greeted familiar faces on front porches, and attended Sunday services where hope was preached as confidently as faith itself. On the surface, Hamilton was exactly the kind of city where terrible crimes were expected to happen somewhere else. People locked their doors, but not always. Children played outside until the streetlights flickered on. Shopkeepers recognized regular customers by name. A missing husband usually had an explanation that involved work, travel, or drinking too much at a friend's house rather than murder. That illusion of safety was powerful because it was built from repetition. Every ordinary morning convinced people that tomorrow would resemble yesterday. Yet cities often hide their deepest secrets in plain sight. Behind respectable curtains and freshly painted doors lived marriages that had begun to crack under financial pressure, emotional distance, and the invisible trauma many veterans carried home from the war. Some men returned physically intact but emotionally transformed. Others struggled to find work that gave them the same sense of purpose they had once found in uniform. Families celebrated reunions while quietly learning that surviving a war and recovering from it were not the same thing. Women, too, found themselves navigating a changing society. During the war, many had entered workplaces once reserved for men. As soldiers returned, expectations shifted again. Some embraced the role of homemaker. Others found it difficult to surrender the independence they had briefly experienced. Social expectations remained rigid. Appearance mattered. Reputation mattered even more. In that world, gossip traveled faster than official news. A whispered rumor over coffee could spread through an entire neighborhood before sunset. People noticed expensive dresses. They noticed unfamiliar visitors. They noticed marriages that appeared less affectionate than they once had. Most of all, they noticed women who refused to fit comfortably within society's expectations. Long before Evelyn Dick became a name splashed across newspaper headlines, she was already the subject of quiet conversations among those who believed they understood the difference between respectability and scandal. She possessed striking beauty that naturally drew attention whenever she entered a room. She dressed elegantly, carried herself with confidence, and seemed determined to enjoy comforts that exceeded what many believed her circumstances should allow. In an era when modesty was often praised above ambition, she projected an image that fascinated some people and unsettled others. To admirers, she appeared glamorous. To critics, she appeared mysterious. Neither impression revealed the complete truth. The city itself became an unwitting stage upon which countless assumptions would later be projected. Every cafe where she had once been seen, every department store she had visited, every familiar street she had walked would eventually acquire new meaning through the distorted lens of hindsight. Ordinary moments would become evidence. Casual encounters would become suspicious. Memories would change shape under the pressure of a shocking crime. That transformation had not happened yet. At this point in the story, Hamilton remained unaware that one of its most controversial criminal cases was already taking shape behind closed doors. The neighborhoods surrounding downtown reflected the city's contrasts. Modest homes stood only a short distance from busy factories whose towering structures dominated the skyline. Streetcars rattled through the streets, connecting working-class districts with commercial centers filled with clothing shops, restaurants, theaters, and hotels. Young couples strolled together on weekends, dreaming about the future. Returning servicemen searched for stability. Business owners reopened doors that had survived years of wartime restrictions. Hope existed everywhere. So did frustration. Inflation strained household budgets. Housing shortages forced families into cramped living arrangements. Personal conflicts intensified behind walls that concealed far more than cheerful smiles shown to neighbors. The pressure of rebuilding life after years of sacrifice weighed differently on every household. Crime investigators understood something the average citizen rarely considered. The most dangerous violence often grew quietly. It rarely announced itself. It accumulated through resentment, deception, desperation, jealousy, or fear until a single irreversible moment changed everything. No detective walking the streets of Hamilton could have predicted exactly where that moment would emerge. Yet somewhere within the city, decisions were already being made that would end with a body abandoned on an isolated hillside. The legal system of the 1940s also looked very different from the one people know today. Forensic science was advancing, but it remained limited compared with modern standards. Investigators relied heavily upon witness statements, physical observations, and painstaking detective work. DNA analysis did not exist. Computer databases were unimaginable. Every fingerprint card, every photograph, every interview required careful manual organization. Mistakes carried enormous consequences. A single overlooked detail could delay justice for years. Likewise, public opinion held extraordinary influence. Newspapers shaped perceptions long before trials concluded. Reporters competed for dramatic headlines, and sensational crimes often became national spectacles. Once someone was portrayed as either villain or victim, changing that image proved remarkably difficult, regardless of what later evidence suggested. This environment would become crucial in the months ahead. The investigation into John Dick's death would unfold not only inside police stations and courtrooms but also across front pages, dining tables, barbershops, and factory break rooms. Thousands of strangers would form opinions long before every fact became known. Some would never change those opinions, even decades later. Looking back now, it is tempting to imagine that history followed an inevitable path, that every clue naturally led investigators toward the answers they sought. Reality was far more uncertain. Before detectives discovered bloodstains. Before hidden evidence emerged. Before courtroom battles captivated the nation. There was only an ordinary industrial city waking each morning beneath clouds of steel smoke, unaware that it was about to become forever associated with one of Canada's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Hamilton did not choose to become part of criminal history. It simply became the place where hidden lives, fragile relationships, and devastating choices collided with irreversible consequences. And as spring slowly replaced winter in 1946, the city continued its daily routine, never realizing that behind familiar doors, beneath carefully maintained appearances, and inside one troubled marriage, events were already unfolding that would challenge investigators, divide public opinion, and leave questions that would remain unanswered for generations. John Dick entered history through the brutal circumstances of his death, but long before his name appeared in newspaper headlines, he was simply another man trying to build an ordinary life in a city that promised opportunity to those willing to work hard. Like countless Canadians living through the uncertain years that followed the Second World War, he carried hopes that were neither grand nor unusual. He wanted stability. He wanted companionship. He wanted the kind of future that seemed within reach after years of global conflict. Those who knew him described a man who was practical more than charismatic. He was not the loudest voice in a room, nor someone who naturally sought attention. His life revolved around work, routine, and the belief that persistence would eventually be rewarded. Friends remembered him as someone capable of laughter, but also someone who could become stubborn when disagreements arose. He was imperfect, as every human being is, yet nothing in his ordinary habits hinted that his life would one day become the center of one of Canada's most disturbing criminal investigations. When John met Evelyn, the attraction seemed immediate. She possessed a striking appearance that naturally drew attention wherever she went. People noticed the way she dressed, the confidence with which she carried herself, and the ease with which conversations seemed to revolve around her. To a man searching for affection and excitement after years marked by uncertainty, she may have represented the possibility of a brighter chapter. Relationships often begin with carefully chosen moments. A shared smile. A lingering conversation. An afternoon that ends too quickly. The future is imagined before it is tested. For John and Evelyn, those early days likely contained many of the ordinary dreams shared by newly engaged couples. Marriage promised companionship, respectability, and the chance to begin again in a society eager to celebrate fresh starts after the hardships of war. They married late in 1945. From the outside, it appeared to be the beginning of an ordinary life together. But appearances can be remarkably fragile. The honeymoon period faded quickly, replaced by growing tension that those closest to the couple could sense even if they did not fully understand its cause. Small disagreements became larger arguments. Expectations collided with reality. Trust, once freely given, became increasingly difficult to maintain. Historical records make clear that the marriage deteriorated rapidly, but they do not preserve every private conversation, every silent dinner, or every sleepless night. Behind the closed doors of their home, emotions that never reached public view slowly accumulated. Like cracks forming beneath fresh paint, the damage remained hidden until it became impossible to ignore. Money appears repeatedly in accounts surrounding their relationship. Evelyn seemed able to maintain a lifestyle that puzzled many observers. Attractive clothing, social outings, and expensive tastes contrasted with questions about how those comforts were being financed. Whether those questions produced suspicion, resentment, or repeated arguments inside the marriage can only be partially reconstructed today, but financial strain has long been recognized as one of the pressures capable of weakening even strong relationships. Another source of conflict was trust itself. During this period, Evelyn maintained a relationship with another man, Bill Bohozuk. The precise emotional dynamics between the three individuals remain the subject of historical debate, and many details were clouded by contradictory testimony given during later investigations. What is clear is that the existence of another romantic relationship complicated an already unstable marriage and introduced further uncertainty into the lives of everyone involved. Imagine the emotional landscape rather than the sensational headlines. A husband wondering where his wife has been. A wife feeling trapped by expectations she no longer wishes to meet. Conversations that begin calmly but end in silence. Promises made during happier days slowly losing their meaning. Neither marriage nor love collapses in a single afternoon. They erode through countless moments too small to remember individually but powerful enough to change everything when combined. Neighbors rarely witness those moments. Instead, they notice only fragments. Raised voices through thin walls. Long absences. Expressions that seem more tired than they were weeks before. Smiles that disappear almost as quickly as they appear. To the outside world, John and Evelyn were simply another married couple navigating the challenges of post-war life. Only later would those ordinary observations be revisited, examined, and interpreted as possible warning signs. John himself remained, in many ways, an ordinary man surrounded by extraordinary circumstances he could not fully control. He continued moving through familiar streets, interacting with co-workers and acquaintances who had little reason to believe anything was terribly wrong. Routine has a remarkable ability to disguise approaching tragedy. People continue making plans for tomorrow even when tomorrow will never arrive. There is something profoundly unsettling about that truth. At some point, John experienced his final ordinary morning without realizing it was his last. He likely dressed as he always did. Walked familiar streets. Thought about responsibilities waiting to be completed. Perhaps he believed that whatever difficulties existed within his marriage could eventually be resolved. Perhaps he did not. History cannot answer those private questions. What history does reveal is that the distance between normal life and unimaginable violence is sometimes measured not in years or months, but in a handful of irreversible decisions. That reality transforms every surviving photograph of John Dick. His face no longer appears simply as that of an ordinary husband. It becomes the face of a man whose final days remain partially hidden behind conflicting testimony, missing evidence, and unanswered questions. For investigators, identifying the victim would eventually provide direction. For the public, however, John gradually became overshadowed by the sensational details surrounding the case. Newspapers focused heavily on Evelyn, on courtroom drama, and on the horrifying condition of the body that had been discovered. In doing so, the victim himself often faded into the background. Yet every criminal case begins with a human life that existed long before the crime. John had family. He had acquaintances. He occupied a place within his community. His disappearance created uncertainty before it created headlines. Someone eventually realized he was no longer where he was expected to be. Someone wondered why familiar routines had stopped. Someone waited for an explanation that never came. That absence carries its own quiet form of grief. Long before investigators pieced together physical evidence, there were unanswered phone calls, empty chairs, and ordinary routines interrupted without warning. Those moments rarely receive the same attention as dramatic courtroom testimony. But they matter. They remind us that victims are not defined solely by the way they die. They are defined by the lives they were living before violence interrupted them. John Dick never had the opportunity to explain his side of the story. His voice survives only through fragments preserved in witness statements, legal documents, and the memories of those who knew him. Everything else was swallowed by silence. And before detectives could begin searching for justice, they first had to answer the most basic question of all. What had happened to the man who had once believed he was simply beginning a new chapter of his life? By the time the torso had been officially identified as John Dick, the investigation had already begun shifting in a direction that would define the entire case. What started as a search for the identity of a victim was transforming into something far more complex, a reconstruction of relationships, timelines, and human contradictions buried beneath layers of silence and suspicion. Detectives returned repeatedly to the last confirmed sightings of John while he was still alive. Each witness statement became a fragile thread in a larger web they were trying to weave. Some recalled seeing him alone, walking through familiar streets, his posture unremarkable, his expression neutral, as though nothing in his world had changed. Others remembered brief conversations, casual interactions that, at the time, had seemed meaningless. Now every word was re-examined under a different light, as if hidden meanings might suddenly emerge from ordinary dialogue. The challenge was not only in what people said, but in what they failed to remember. Memory is rarely precise, especially when it does not seem important in the moment it is formed. A man walking home from work does not usually become a fixed point in someone's mind unless something unusual occurs. That gap in human recollection became a quiet obstacle for investigators trying to reconstruct the final movements of a murdered man. Attention inevitably turned toward John's personal life. In homicide investigations, the closest relationships are often the first places where contradictions appear. Marriage, finances, emotional tension, and secrecy can all create friction points that later manifest as investigative leads. John's marriage to Evelyn quickly became a central focus, not because it was immediately proven to be connected to the crime, but because it represented the most intimate and therefore most relevant relationship in his life. When detectives began speaking to those who knew the couple, the picture they received was fragmented. Some described Evelyn as charming, confident, even captivating in a way that made her difficult to ignore. Others saw instability beneath the surface, a sense that her life contained elements that did not fully align with what she presented publicly. These impressions were not evidence, but they shaped the direction of questioning in subtle ways that would later become significant. The home John shared with Evelyn became one of the most important physical locations in the investigation. Inside any domestic space, traces of life accumulate quietly. Objects are moved, used, and returned without thought. Yet in the aftermath of a violent crime, every object becomes potentially meaningful. Investigators moved carefully through rooms that had once been private, searching not only for obvious signs of struggle but also for the less visible residue of human behavior. What they found did not offer a complete narrative, but it did raise questions. There were indications that something had occurred within the residence that was inconsistent with normal domestic life. Certain observations suggested disturbance, though interpretation remained cautious. In cases like this, the line between certainty and speculation must remain firmly controlled, because assumptions can easily distort an investigation that depends on precision. One of the most disturbing aspects of the early findings was the discovery of biological evidence linked to John inside the residence. Its presence supported the conclusion that at least part of the violence had occurred indoors rather than at the location where the torso was later abandoned. This shifted the investigative focus further into the private sphere of the household, reinforcing the idea that the crime was not random but deeply connected to personal relationships. As forensic analysis continued, attention also turned to objects that could potentially be associated with the disposal or processing of the body. Items that might once have seemed ordinary in a domestic environment took on new significance when viewed through the lens of violent crime. Investigators did not rush to conclusions, but they documented everything meticulously, understanding that even minor details could later become critical. At the same time, the emotional tone of the investigation began to change. The discovery of a dismembered body had already shocked the community, but as the case moved closer to the private lives of those involved, it began to generate a different kind of tension. This was no longer only about a brutal act committed against a single victim. It was becoming a story about trust, betrayal, and the hidden fractures within relationships that outwardly appeared ordinary. Evelyn herself quickly became a figure of intense interest. Her public demeanor during initial interactions with authorities was noted carefully. Investigators observed not only what she said, but how she said it, how she reacted to questions, and how her narrative aligned or failed to align with other available information. In criminal investigations, consistency is often as important as content, and any deviation can lead to deeper scrutiny. Yet at this stage, certainty remained elusive. There was no single piece of evidence that definitively explained the sequence of events leading to John's death. Instead, there were fragments. A timeline that did not fully align. Witness accounts that conflicted in small but meaningful ways. Physical evidence that suggested violence had occurred but did not reveal exactly how or why. This ambiguity created space for multiple interpretations. Investigators had to consider whether the crime involved only one perpetrator or whether others might have been present or involved in different stages of the act. The possibility of assistance in the aftermath of the killing also could not be dismissed, particularly given the logistical difficulty of moving and dismembering a human body without attracting attention. Each new theory introduced additional questions. If more than one person was involved, what roles did they play? If the act was committed by a single individual, what level of planning and psychological capacity would that require? These questions did not produce immediate answers, but they shaped the trajectory of the investigation. Outside the investigative process, the public began to form its own interpretations. Newspapers reported selectively, emphasizing the most sensational aspects of the case while omitting the uncertainties that detectives were still struggling to resolve. In this environment, perception often moved faster than fact, and once a narrative began to form in the public imagination, it became difficult to alter. Within the police department, however, caution remained essential. Experienced investigators understood that early assumptions in homicide cases can be misleading. The presence of strong suspicion does not equal proof, and emotional response must never replace evidentiary standards. Despite the pressure from media attention and public curiosity, the case required careful, methodical progression. As the investigation moved forward, one reality became increasingly clear. The death of John Dick was not an isolated event that could be explained by a single moment of violence. It was the result of a sequence of decisions, each one building upon the last, leading from domestic tension into irreversible tragedy. Understanding those decisions would require not only physical evidence, but also a reconstruction of human behavior that might never be fully complete. And so the investigation continued, moving deeper into the private world of those who had once shared a home with the victim, approaching a truth that remained just out of reach, hidden beneath contradictions, silence, and the irreversible passage of time. By the time investigators had fully confirmed the identity of the torso as John Dick, the case had already begun to shift from a field investigation into something far more psychologically complex. The hillside where the remains had been discovered was no longer the center of attention. Instead, it had become a starting point, a place that answered one question only to open dozens more. The real investigation now moved inward, away from the open air of the escarpment and into the enclosed, suffocating spaces where John had last lived. The absence of the head, arms, and legs remained one of the most disturbing elements of the crime. It was not only a forensic obstacle but also a symbolic one. Whoever had committed the act had not simply ended a life. They had attempted to erase identity itself. In criminal investigations, dismemberment often signals an effort to delay identification or to complicate the search for evidence. But in this case, the precision and completeness of the removal suggested more than improvisation. It suggested time, control, and a willingness to continue engaging with the body long after death had occurred. As detectives reviewed the evidence, they began to reconstruct a sequence that was no longer based on speculation alone, but on physical interpretation. The condition of the remains indicated that death had preceded dismemberment. The nature of the injuries suggested a firearm had been used before any post-mortem manipulation. That detail shifted the entire framework of the investigation. It meant that the killing itself was likely separate from the subsequent actions taken to conceal it, and that at least two distinct phases of criminal activity had occurred. The first phase was the act of murder. The second was the attempt to control what remained afterward. This distinction mattered because it pointed away from a spontaneous act of rage and toward something more deliberate. The effort required to remove body parts, transport them, and dispose of them in a remote area implied planning or at least sustained intention. It also implied familiarity with the environment in which these actions took place. The killer was not simply reacting. The killer was managing consequences. Attention inevitably turned toward the last known environment in which John had lived. His home, shared with Evelyn Dick, became the central focus of the investigation. What had once been a private domestic space was now treated as a reconstructed crime scene. Every surface, every object, and every trace of biological material was examined with the understanding that domestic environments often retain evidence that cannot easily be removed without leaving behind subtle indicators. Inside the residence, investigators found traces that suggested violent activity had occurred there. The presence of biological evidence associated with John was particularly significant. It supported the conclusion that at least part of the fatal sequence had taken place indoors rather than at the site where the body was later found. This altered the narrative again. The escarpment was not a crime scene. It was a disposal site. The true scene of the crime remained hidden within the private boundaries of a home. Once that realization took hold, the investigation expanded into a broader examination of relationships and behaviors. Detectives began interviewing individuals who had interacted with John and Evelyn in the period leading up to his disappearance. These interviews produced a fragmented picture. Some witnesses described the couple as unstable, others as outwardly normal. There was no single consistent account that clearly explained the deterioration of their relationship, but there were enough contradictions to justify closer scrutiny. Evelyn's behavior during initial interactions with authorities was carefully documented. Investigators noted her responses, her emotional tone, and the consistency of her statements. In cases involving intimate partners, the behavior of a spouse is often examined not because it automatically implies guilt, but because it is one of the few available sources of insight into the victim's final environment. Every detail, no matter how small, was evaluated for potential relevance. At the same time, investigators were aware of the danger of premature conclusions. Suspicion can form quickly in emotionally charged cases, especially when the crime involves dismemberment and concealment. But suspicion without evidence can distort the direction of an investigation. For that reason, the team remained focused on corroboration rather than interpretation. The home itself provided more questions than answers. Certain observations suggested that events inside the residence had not been consistent with ordinary domestic life, but the exact sequence of those events remained unclear. Without complete forensic reconstruction, investigators could not definitively determine how the confrontation had unfolded, who had been present at specific moments, or what actions had been taken immediately after the fatal incident. What was becoming increasingly apparent, however, was that this case could not be understood through a single moment. It was not the result of an isolated act. It was the outcome of a chain of events, each one building upon the last, each one narrowing the possibilities of reversal. Somewhere within that chain, a decision had been made that transformed conflict into irreversible violence. As the investigation deepened, another layer of complexity emerged. The removal of John's identifying features meant that whoever had committed the act had demonstrated awareness of investigative procedures. This raised the possibility that the perpetrator understood, at least in a general sense, how bodies are identified and how evidence can be used to reconstruct identity. Whether this understanding was sophisticated or intuitive remained unclear, but it suggested a level of awareness beyond blind impulse. Despite these emerging patterns, the case still lacked a definitive narrative. There was no confirmed timeline of events inside the home. There was no direct eyewitness account of the killing. There was no recovered weapon that could conclusively be linked to the fatal wound. The investigation was therefore built on accumulation rather than certainty, on convergence rather than direct proof. Meanwhile, public awareness of the case began to grow. News of the discovery and the unusual condition of the body spread quickly, and with it came speculation that often outpaced verified information. The gap between what was known by investigators and what was assumed by the public widened rapidly. In that gap, narratives began to form that were shaped more by imagination than by evidence. Inside the investigative team, however, the focus remained disciplined. Every lead was followed, every piece of physical evidence catalogued, every statement cross-referenced. The goal was not to construct a story, but to reconstruct reality as precisely as possible. And in that process, the home shared by John and Evelyn became the most critical location in the entire case. It was within that space, investigators believed, that the final chapter of John Dick's life had begun. Not on the hillside where his remains were discovered, but behind closed doors where relationships, tensions, and decisions had reached a point of irreversible consequence. The investigation was now moving toward its most difficult phase, where suspicion would begin to crystallize into focus, and where the line between possibility and accusation would start to narrow under the weight of accumulating evidence. By the time the investigation reached its sixth phase, the case of John Dick had already moved far beyond the initial shock of discovery. What remained was no longer a simple search for an unknown killer, but a tightening circle of scrutiny around a small number of individuals whose lives were intertwined with the victim's final days. In homicide investigations, this is the moment when distance begins to disappear, when abstract evidence becomes personal, and when every inconsistency in a statement carries the weight of potential consequence. The attention of investigators increasingly converged on Evelyn Dick, not because guilt had been established, but because proximity demanded examination. She was John's wife, the person most closely connected to his daily life, and the last known figure within the intimate space where he had lived. In criminal logic, proximity is not proof, but it is direction. It tells investigators where to look next when the wider field of possibilities becomes too large to manage. Evelyn's statements were recorded, reviewed, and compared against known physical evidence. At this stage of an investigation, consistency is as important as content. A narrative that shifts under repeated questioning does not automatically indicate deception, but it does indicate instability in memory or interpretation. Investigators carefully mapped her account of events, aligning it against forensic findings and witness observations. Where alignment failed, new questions emerged. At the same time, detectives expanded their inquiry into the broader social environment surrounding the couple. Friends, acquaintances, and neighbors were interviewed in an attempt to reconstruct the emotional landscape of the marriage. What emerged was not a single unified picture, but a collection of impressions that varied depending on perspective and proximity. Some described tension, others described normalcy, and many admitted they had not been close enough to the couple to form reliable conclusions. This fragmentation itself became meaningful. When no single narrative dominates, investigators are forced to consider whether private dynamics were more complex than outward appearances suggested. The absence of consensus did not point to innocence or guilt, but it did reinforce the idea that the relationship between John and Evelyn contained unresolved conflict that had not been visible to the wider community. As scrutiny increased, attention also turned toward financial and personal circumstances. Investigators examined patterns of behavior, spending, and association in the months leading up to John's death. These elements are often used not as direct evidence of murder, but as contextual indicators that help establish motive or pressure. In this case, however, clarity remained elusive. The available information suggested instability but did not provide a clear narrative of cause and effect. The investigation also briefly expanded toward other individuals connected to Evelyn, including those who had maintained social or personal relationships with her. Among these was Bill Bohozuk, whose association with Evelyn introduced additional complexity into the case. His presence in the broader narrative contributed to investigative uncertainty, not because he was immediately implicated, but because his connection to Evelyn introduced the possibility of overlapping relationships that might have influenced events in ways not yet fully understood. Detectives approached these leads cautiously. In complex homicide investigations, expanding the suspect pool too quickly can dilute focus and delay resolution. Each potential involvement had to be weighed against physical evidence, timelines, and corroborated testimony. At this stage, no external individual had been directly linked to the physical act of murder or dismemberment, but their relevance to the broader context remained under consideration. Inside the home shared by John and Evelyn, investigators continued to analyze physical evidence. The environment itself remained one of the most significant sources of information. Domestic spaces often preserve traces of events in ways that are not immediately visible. Patterns of disturbance, biological residues, and object displacement can all contribute to a reconstructed timeline when interpreted carefully. What made this case particularly challenging was the deliberate alteration of evidence after death. The removal of body parts had already eliminated key forensic opportunities. Without a complete body, certain forms of analysis were impossible. This meant that investigators had to rely more heavily on indirect evidence and inference, increasing the importance of every remaining detail. As the investigation progressed, a subtle shift began to occur. The case was no longer simply about determining what happened to John Dick. It was becoming about understanding how an entire sequence of events could unfold within a domestic environment without immediate external detection. This required reconstructing not only actions, but also opportunities, access, and timing. Evelyn's role in this reconstruction remained central. Her presence within the household placed her at the intersection of nearly every investigative pathway. However, presence alone is not equivalent to culpability. Investigators were careful to distinguish between association and action, recognizing that legal standards require far more than proximity or suspicion. Despite this caution, pressure surrounding the case continued to grow. The unusual nature of the crime, particularly the dismemberment and disposal of the body, attracted public attention and media speculation. Outside the controlled environment of the investigation, narratives began to form that often simplified or exaggerated available information. These narratives, while not part of the official inquiry, inevitably influenced the broader context in which the case developed. Within the investigative team, however, discipline remained essential. Detectives understood that premature conclusions could compromise the integrity of the case. Each piece of evidence had to be evaluated independently before being integrated into a broader theory. This methodical approach slowed the process but increased reliability. At this stage, no definitive reconstruction of the killing had been achieved. The timeline inside the home remained partially speculative, the sequence of actions surrounding the death remained incomplete, and the exact roles of individuals present during the critical period remained unconfirmed. What investigators had instead was a convergence of indicators pointing toward a domestic origin of violence, followed by deliberate post-mortem concealment. The challenge moving forward was to transform this convergence into a legally defensible narrative supported by admissible evidence. In homicide cases, suspicion may guide investigation, but only evidence can support prosecution. This distinction defined every decision made by the investigative team as they moved closer to formal charges. By the end of this phase, the investigation had narrowed significantly in focus, but not yet in certainty. The field of possibilities had contracted, yet critical gaps remained. Those gaps would soon become the center of legal scrutiny as the case transitioned from investigation into prosecution, where theories would be tested not only against evidence, but against the strict standards of the courtroom. And as that transition approached, the case of John Dick was no longer just a mystery of a dismembered body found on a hillside. It had become a tightly focused examination of relationships, contradictions, and the fragile boundary between suspicion and proof, a boundary that would soon be tested under the pressure of public trial. The courtroom in Hamilton became the final stage where the fragmented truth of John Dick's death was forced into a structured legal narrative. By the time the trial reached its full momentum in 1946, the case had already evolved far beyond a simple homicide investigation. It had become a confrontation between two competing realities, one built from investigative reconstruction and forensic inference, the other bound by the strict limitations of legal proof. Inside the courtroom, every detail of the case was replayed with deliberate precision. The prosecution presented a sequence of events that began in the domestic space shared by John and Evelyn Dick and ended on the isolated slopes of the Niagara Escarpment where his torso was discovered. Their argument was built on convergence rather than a single definitive moment. The absence of a head, arms, and legs was not treated as an isolated detail but as part of a broader pattern of deliberate concealment. The gunshot wound that caused John's death established the first act. The dismemberment established the second. The transportation of the remains established the third. Together, they formed a narrative that the prosecution argued could not be explained by coincidence or external interference. Witness testimony filled the gaps between physical evidence and interpretation. Neighbors and acquaintances described fragments of the couple's life, moments that had seemed insignificant at the time but now carried new weight under legal scrutiny. Some spoke of tension, others of emotional distance, and others admitted they had not known the couple well enough to offer certainty. Yet even these incomplete observations contributed to the prosecution's broader argument that instability existed within the relationship in ways that were not visible on the surface. The forensic evidence played a central role in shaping the prosecution's case. Investigators described biological traces found within the residence, which supported the conclusion that violence had occurred inside the home rather than at the location where the body was discovered. The condition of the remains reinforced this interpretation. The dismemberment was not random or chaotic but appeared controlled, deliberate, and carried out after death. The prosecution emphasized that such actions required time, access, and an environment where the act could be completed without interruption. The escarpment itself was redefined in court not as a crime scene but as a disposal site. This distinction was critical. It meant that the killing had taken place elsewhere and that the body had been moved afterward. The prosecution argued that this required familiarity with both the victim and the environment in which the body was handled. It was not an act consistent with a stranger or opportunistic offender acting in isolation. The defense approached the same evidence from a fundamentally different perspective. They argued that the prosecution's narrative relied heavily on interpretation rather than direct observation. No witness had seen the killing. No weapon had been conclusively tied to the fatal wound. No complete forensic reconstruction of the sequence inside the home had been established with certainty. In their view, the case was built on inference layered upon inference, each step dependent on the assumption that the previous one was correct. They also highlighted the limitations created by the condition of the body. The absence of the head and limbs meant that certain forensic possibilities were permanently closed. Without those missing parts, the defense argued, identification of specific mechanisms and additional trauma patterns could not be fully verified. This absence created gaps in the evidentiary record that should, under legal standards, be interpreted in favor of reasonable doubt. Evelyn Dick herself stood at the center of this legal conflict, not only as a defendant but as the focal point through which all competing interpretations passed. Her presence in the domestic environment, her relationship to the victim, and her proximity to the timeline of events placed her under intense scrutiny. The prosecution argued that these factors, when combined with the physical evidence, formed a coherent pattern pointing toward responsibility. The defense maintained that proximity could not be equated with causation and that suspicion, no matter how strongly constructed, was not sufficient for conviction. Throughout the trial, the courtroom atmosphere reflected the weight of the case. It was not simply a legal proceeding but a public examination of violence, relationships, and the hidden fractures that can exist beneath ordinary appearances. Every testimony was dissected, every piece of evidence reinterpreted, and every contradiction analyzed in search of clarity that the physical investigation alone had not fully provided. The jury was ultimately tasked with navigating between two different forms of truth. One was investigative truth, built from reconstruction, probability, and the elimination of alternative scenarios. The other was legal truth, defined by the requirement of proof beyond reasonable doubt. These two frameworks did not always align, and in this case, the tension between them became the defining feature of the proceedings. The initial verdict reflected acceptance of the prosecution's narrative. Evelyn was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death, a decision that indicated the jury believed the cumulative weight of evidence pointed sufficiently toward responsibility. The ruling suggested that the convergence of forensic findings, circumstantial evidence, and behavioral interpretation had collectively met the threshold required for conviction. However, the legal process did not end there. Upon appeal, the conviction was overturned. The appellate court identified issues related to the handling of evidence and the admissibility of certain statements made during the investigation. These procedural concerns were significant enough to undermine the validity of the original verdict, regardless of the underlying factual narrative constructed during trial. The reversal did not establish innocence. It dismantled the legal foundation of the conviction, returning the case to a state of unresolved judicial ambiguity regarding the murder of John Dick. This outcome highlighted one of the most important distinctions in criminal justice systems, the difference between what is strongly suggested by evidence and what is legally proven in accordance with procedural standards. The courtroom, which had initially been expected to provide closure, instead revealed the limits of legal resolution in cases built on incomplete forensic reconstruction. The missing body parts, the absence of direct eyewitness testimony, and the reliance on circumstantial convergence all contributed to a case that could be interpreted in multiple ways depending on the standard applied. By the end of the trial process, the case of John Dick existed in a space between certainty and uncertainty. Investigators had constructed a compelling narrative supported by physical and contextual evidence. The courts had tested that narrative against legal standards and found it procedurally insufficient to sustain a final conviction. What remained was not resolution, but structured ambiguity. A case that could be argued convincingly in one framework and contested successfully in another. A set of facts that pointed strongly in a particular direction, yet never crossed the threshold required to eliminate doubt entirely. And in that unresolved space, the story of John Dick's death continued to exist, not as a closed chapter of legal history, but as an enduring example of how truth in the courtroom is not only about what can be proven to have happened, but also about what can withstand the strict discipline of law when every missing piece matters as much as the ones that remain. If there is a final lesson embedded in the case of John Dick, it is not about the brutality of a single crime, but about the fragile architecture of truth itself when it is forced to survive through incomplete evidence, human interpretation, and the limits of legal certainty. Long after the investigations ended and the courtrooms fell silent, what remains is not resolution but a structured uncertainty that continues to define how the case is remembered. The story begins, as all homicide cases do, with a human life that existed outside the context of violence. John Dick was not defined by the manner of his death until the moment his remains were discovered. Before that, he existed within the ordinary framework of post-war life in Hamilton, shaped by work, relationships, and personal expectation. The tragedy of his case is not only that his life ended violently, but that the circumstances of his death transformed him into something abstract, a subject of investigation rather than a fully reconstructed individual history. When his torso was found on the escarpment, the immediate reaction was shock, but the deeper consequence was fragmentation. Identity had been deliberately disrupted. The removal of his head and limbs was not just a forensic obstacle, it was an attempt to erase recognition itself. That act created a void that investigators were forced to fill through reconstruction, inference, and the careful alignment of partial truths. Yet no reconstruction, no matter how detailed, could fully restore what had been intentionally removed. As the case developed, it became clear that the investigation was not only about determining who committed the act, but about understanding how domestic life can transform into a space where violence becomes possible. The home shared by John and Evelyn Dick became the focal point of that transformation. Within its walls, investigators sought traces of sequence, intention, and consequence. What they found did not produce a complete narrative, but a pattern of indicators that suggested a progression from conflict to irreversible action. The legal process that followed attempted to convert this investigative pattern into judicial certainty. The courtroom became the space where fragmented evidence was assembled into competing narratives. One narrative emphasized convergence, arguing that the totality of evidence pointed toward a domestic origin of violence and deliberate concealment. The other emphasized the absence of direct proof, arguing that gaps in the forensic record and procedural concerns prevented a definitive conclusion. Neither narrative fully eliminated the other. Instead, they coexisted within the boundaries of legal argument, each strong within its own framework, each limited by the standards required to validate it. The initial conviction reflected one interpretation of that evidence. The subsequent overturning reflected the legal system's insistence that interpretation alone is not enough when procedural integrity is in question. Together, these outcomes created a legal paradox in which strong suspicion and formal uncertainty remained permanently intertwined. Over time, the case moved beyond the courtroom and into historical and cultural memory. It became a reference point not only for discussions of criminal behavior, but also for discussions about how justice systems handle incomplete information. The absence of final legal resolution for the murder of John Dick ensured that the case would remain open in the intellectual sense, even if it was closed in the procedural one. What continues to define the case is not what is known, but what cannot be fully known. The exact sequence of events inside the home remains partially unreconstructed. The precise roles of individuals involved remain legally unconfirmed in relation to the murder itself. The missing body parts ensure that certain forensic possibilities will never be recovered. These absences are not minor details. They are structural limitations that shape every interpretation of the case. At the same time, the case demonstrates how human behavior under pressure can produce outcomes that resist simple explanation. Relationships that appear ordinary from the outside can contain tensions that are not visible until they reach a breaking point. Once that point is reached, the consequences extend beyond the individuals involved and into the systems that must later attempt to reconstruct what occurred. For investigators, the case remains an example of how convergence of evidence can guide understanding without guaranteeing certainty. For legal scholars, it illustrates the boundary between proof and inference. For the public, it endures as a narrative shaped as much by absence as by presence, where what is missing is often as significant as what is known. John Dick's death cannot be fully restored to its original moment. It exists now only through interpretation layered over fragments of evidence, testimony, and reconstruction. Evelyn Dick's name remains attached to the case not as a simple conclusion, but as part of a broader unresolved history that continues to invite questions rather than closure. In the end, the case does not offer a final answer. Instead, it offers a reminder that some truths remain permanently divided between what can be demonstrated and what can only be inferred, between the certainty required by law and the ambiguity preserved by time, between the need for closure and the reality of what evidence allows. And in that space between certainty and uncertainty, the story of John Dick continues to exist, not as a finished chapter, but as a lasting question about how far truth can be reconstructed when the most critical pieces are gone, and whether justice is always capable of fully capturing what actually happened behind closed doors in the final moments of a human life. If the case of John Dick has survived for so long in public memory, it is not because it offers resolution, but because it refuses to settle into a single, stable interpretation. Time has a way of softening many criminal cases, allowing them to fade into archival records and forgotten headlines. Yet this one continues to resist that fading, not through new evidence or new legal developments, but through the persistence of its unanswered structure. At its core, the case remains defined by absence. The missing head, the missing limbs, and the missing certainty of what occurred inside the home are not simply forensic gaps. They are structural voids that shape every attempt at understanding. Investigators were able to reconstruct a probable sequence of events, and courts were able to evaluate that reconstruction within legal frameworks, but neither process was able to restore what had been deliberately removed from the physical record. This absence created a lasting tension between two forms of truth. One is the truth constructed through investigation, where patterns, probabilities, and convergence of evidence form a coherent narrative. The other is the truth demanded by law, where certainty must be high enough to eliminate reasonable doubt. In the case of John Dick, these two forms never fully aligned. They moved closer at times, diverged at others, but never fully merged into a single final conclusion that could close the case entirely in both domains. Over the years, reinterpretations of the case have continued to emerge, each shaped by the language and priorities of its time. Earlier accounts emphasized shock and moral framing, focusing on the brutality of the dismemberment and the figure of Evelyn Dick as the central subject of public fascination. Later analyses shifted toward forensic interpretation and procedural critique, examining how evidence was collected, how statements were obtained, and how legal standards influenced the final outcome. Each generation has approached the same set of facts differently, yet none has succeeded in resolving the core uncertainty. What remains consistent across all interpretations is the recognition that the crime did not occur in isolation. It unfolded within a domestic environment shaped by relationships, financial pressure, emotional instability, and the invisible tensions that often exist behind outward appearances. These conditions do not explain the crime in a deterministic way, but they provide the context in which investigators believed the fatal sequence became possible. Evelyn Dick's later life, lived largely outside public view, contributes another layer of ambiguity. After her release from prison and subsequent withdrawal from public attention, she became a figure defined more by historical record than by personal narrative. The absence of detailed information about her later years reinforces the sense that the case itself never fully transitioned into closure. Instead, it dispersed into fragments of legal documentation, media interpretation, and historical reference. John Dick, by contrast, remains permanently fixed in the moment of his death. His identity is no longer shaped by personal memory or lived experience, but by forensic reconstruction and legal debate. He exists within the case as both victim and evidentiary anchor, the point around which every investigative and judicial argument ultimately revolves. The enduring significance of the case lies not in what it definitively proves, but in what it demonstrates about the limits of reconstruction. Even with physical evidence, witness testimony, and structured legal processes, there are circumstances in which the full sequence of human actions cannot be completely recovered. Deliberate destruction of evidence, missing remains, and procedural limitations combine to create spaces where certainty cannot fully enter. For criminal investigators, this case remains a reminder that convergence of evidence can produce strong conclusions without guaranteeing completeness. For legal systems, it highlights the distinction between persuasive narrative and legally sufficient proof. For historians and true crime analysts, it stands as an example of how unresolved elements can preserve a case within public consciousness long after its practical investigative phase has ended. There is also a quieter lesson embedded within it, one that extends beyond law and investigation. It concerns the fragile nature of human understanding when confronted with irreversible events. Once violence has occurred and evidence has been altered or removed, the ability to reconstruct truth becomes dependent on what remains, not on what once existed. In that sense, every missing piece is not just an obstacle, but a permanent limitation on knowledge itself. The case of John Dick does not conclude with resolution because resolution requires completeness, and completeness is exactly what the case denies. Instead, it persists as a structured uncertainty, a narrative held together by partial evidence and constrained interpretation. It is neither fully open nor fully closed, but suspended in a state where interpretation continues indefinitely. And perhaps that is why it continues to be revisited. Not because it can finally be solved, but because it illustrates something fundamental about criminal truth itself. That even when investigation is thorough, and even when courts have spoken, there are cases where the final answer is not a conclusion, but an acknowledgement of limits. In the end, the story of John Dick remains what it has always been since the moment his remains were first discovered on a quiet hillside above Hamilton. A story defined not only by what was done, but by what can no longer be fully known. A reminder that some truths survive not through resolution, but through the questions they leave behind. There is a final layer to the case of John Dick that emerges only when all investigative detail, legal argument, and historical reinterpretation have been set aside, leaving behind something quieter and more unsettling. It is the realization that some cases do not end when the investigation concludes or when the courtroom delivers its verdict. They end only in the sense that the system can no longer actively pursue them. The narrative itself continues to exist, shaped by what was never recovered, never confirmed, and never fully explained. In John Dick's case, that unfinished quality is not a side effect of poor investigation. It is the direct consequence of deliberate fragmentation. The removal of his head and limbs did more than complicate identification. It removed the possibility of complete reconstruction. It ensured that any future attempt to understand the final moments of his life would always begin with absence. Every theory built around the case must therefore account not only for what is known, but for what was intentionally erased. This structural absence creates a kind of permanent distortion in how the case is perceived. Each piece of evidence, no matter how carefully analyzed, exists beside a void that cannot be filled. Investigators could determine that death occurred before dismemberment, but they could not restore the exact sequence of decisions that led to that moment. Courts could evaluate responsibility within legal boundaries, but they could not recover the full experimental truth of what happened inside the home. Historians can analyze patterns and context, but they cannot retrieve the missing physical anchors that would allow absolute certainty. Over time, this has transformed the case into something larger than its original facts. It has become a study in the limits of reconstruction. Not because the investigation failed, but because the conditions of the crime were designed, intentionally or not, to resist full recovery. In that sense, the case is not incomplete due to oversight, but incomplete by design of circumstance. The evidence that exists is real, but it is permanently shaped by what was removed from it. The psychological dimension of the case also continues to resonate. It forces confrontation with the idea that domestic environments, which are typically associated with safety and familiarity, can become sites of irreversible rupture. The transition from ordinary life to fatal violence does not always leave a visible trail of escalation. Sometimes it appears only in hindsight, reconstructed through fragments that do not fully explain how or when the shift occurred. Evelyn Dick's place within this unresolved structure remains one of the most discussed aspects of the case. Legally, her responsibility for the murder of John Dick was never conclusively affirmed through a final, unchallenged conviction. Investigatively, her proximity to the victim and the convergence of evidence placed her at the center of suspicion. These two realities coexist without fully resolving into a single definitive answer, and that coexistence is part of what keeps the case alive in discussion. But the case is not solely about her, nor solely about John. It is about the interaction between evidence and absence, between what can be proven and what can only be inferred. It is about how systems designed to uncover truth must operate within boundaries that are often defined by the destruction or disappearance of the very material they depend on. In this sense, the case of John Dick becomes less a story about a single crime and more a demonstration of structural limitation. Even the most careful investigation cannot recover what has been permanently removed. Even the most thorough trial cannot eliminate doubt that arises from missing information. Even the most detailed historical analysis cannot restore a complete narrative where the foundational elements no longer exist. And so the final understanding of the case is not a conclusion in the traditional sense. It is an acceptance of constraint. An acknowledgement that truth, in some instances, is not fully accessible, not because it is unknown, but because it has been irreversibly fragmented. The role of investigation, law, and history is then not to complete what cannot be completed, but to approach it as closely as possible while recognizing the boundary that cannot be crossed. The case of John Dick remains within that boundary. It is neither solved nor unsolved in a satisfying way. It is held in suspension between certainty and absence, between reconstruction and loss. Every retelling, every analysis, every legal review circles the same central gap without ever fully closing it. And perhaps that is the final message the case leaves behind. That truth in the real world is not always a complete structure waiting to be discovered, but sometimes a partial outline shaped by what survives. That understanding can be precise, even compelling, and still remain incomplete. And that in some rare but powerful cases, the most honest conclusion is not an answer, but the recognition that the answer will never be fully recoverable. In that recognition, the story of John Dick reaches its closest point to closure, not by solving the mystery, but by accepting the permanent distance between what happened and what can ever be known again. If there is a final echo left by the case of John Dick, it is not the echo of violence itself, but the echo of uncertainty that continues to follow it across time. The investigation ended decades ago, the courtroom debates were concluded through formal judgment and appeal, and the individuals directly involved have long since disappeared from public view. Yet the case remains alive in a different form, sustained not by new developments but by the persistence of unresolved meaning. What makes this case endure is not its brutality alone, but the way it exposes the boundaries of human reconstruction. Every criminal investigation is, at its core, an attempt to rebuild a sequence of events that no longer exists in its original form. Investigators gather fragments, witnesses provide partial memories, and forensic science interprets physical traces. From these pieces, a narrative is constructed. But in the case of John Dick, the narrative was always forced to contend with an absence too large to ignore. That absence was created deliberately through dismemberment, a choice that transformed the body into fragmented evidence and the investigation into an exercise in reconstruction under constraint. The missing head and limbs were not just physical losses. They were informational voids that removed entire categories of certainty. Identity, mechanism of death, and full forensic reconstruction were all partially or completely obstructed. What remained was enough to suggest a sequence, but never enough to fully confirm it in absolute terms. As a result, the case occupies a unique position in criminal history. It is not defined by a lack of effort, nor by a failure of investigation. Instead, it is defined by the limits of what investigation can achieve when the foundational material of truth has been altered beyond recovery. Even the most advanced methods of analysis cannot restore what no longer exists. Even the most careful legal reasoning cannot eliminate doubt that arises from structural absence. Over time, this has shaped how the case is remembered. In some retellings, it is framed as a domestic tragedy marked by suspicion and fragmented truth. In others, it is presented as a legal paradox where strong circumstantial evidence collided with procedural requirements for certainty. In all versions, however, the same tension remains. There is a story that feels complete in structure, but incomplete in verification. This tension is what gives the case its lasting psychological weight. It forces a confrontation with the idea that truth is not always fully recoverable, even when evidence is extensive and investigation is thorough. It suggests that there are limits to how far reconstruction can go before it reaches a point where interpretation must replace certainty. And once interpretation takes over, multiple truths can exist side by side without one fully eliminating the others. For those who study the case, whether in legal, forensic, or historical contexts, this becomes the central lesson. Not that the case is unknowable, but that it is partially knowable in a way that cannot be resolved into completeness. Each layer of analysis brings clarity to certain aspects while simultaneously revealing new gaps in others. The more closely the case is examined, the more apparent its structural incompleteness becomes. This is also why the case continues to appear in discussions of criminal law and investigative methodology. It serves as a reminder that evidence does not exist in isolation from its context of preservation. When that context is altered, whether intentionally or through circumstance, the meaning of evidence changes as well. What can be proven is always shaped by what remains available to prove it. In the end, the story of John Dick does not resolve into a final conclusion that satisfies every standard of truth simultaneously. It resolves instead into a layered understanding of limitation. A recognition that even when facts point strongly in a particular direction, the absence of complete information can prevent those facts from becoming absolute certainty within the legal or historical record. And so the case persists, not as an active investigation, and not as a closed chapter, but as a fixed point of reference in the study of unresolved truth. It stands as an example of how violence, evidence, and law interact in ways that can produce strong narratives without producing final answers. It demonstrates that some cases do not end in closure, but in structured incompleteness that no further analysis can fully resolve. That is the final echo of the case of John Dick. Not a conclusion, not a resolution, but the enduring presence of a question that continues to exist even after every official process has ended. A reminder that in rare and difficult cases, truth does not disappear, but remains just beyond the reach of complete recovery, held permanently at the edge of what can be known. At a certain point, every true crime case stops being about what happened and becomes about how we understand what happened. In the case of John Dick, that shift is not subtle. It is the defining feature of everything that followed the discovery of his remains. The facts of the case, as far as they can be established, are already known in outline. a man killed, a body dismembered, remains discovered far from any intact scene, and a domestic environment placed under intense forensic scrutiny. Yet those facts, even when accepted, do not settle the deeper question that continues to linger around the case. What remains unresolved is not the existence of violence, but the exact architecture of responsibility and sequence. Investigators were able to determine that John Dick was killed before his body was dismembered. They were able to conclude that the residence he shared with Evelyn Dick contained traces consistent with violent activity. They were able to establish that the hillside where his torso was found was not the original scene of death. But none of these conclusions, even when combined, produced a fully complete reconstruction of intent, participation, and action that could eliminate every alternative interpretation without remainder. This is where the case becomes more than a historical homicide investigation. It becomes an example of how truth is assembled under constraint. Every investigation operates within the limits of what survives: physical evidence, witness memory, environmental traces, and recorded statements. In most cases, these elements are sufficient to build a stable narrative that aligns with legal standards. In this case, however, the removal of key anatomical evidence and the fragmentation of the body created a structural gap that no amount of reconstruction could entirely close. That gap is not just forensic. It is interpretive. It affects how every piece of evidence is read. A trace in a household becomes more significant because of what is missing elsewhere. A statement gains weight because there is no complete physical record to fully confirm or contradict it. Even the absence of evidence becomes evidence in a limited sense, not because it proves something directly, but because it constrains what can reasonably be proposed. The legal process attempted to stabilize this uncertainty by applying the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt. In doing so, it had to separate what could be strongly inferred from what could be definitively established. The prosecution constructed a narrative that fit the available evidence into a coherent sequence. The defense challenged the completeness of that sequence, emphasizing the absence of direct observation and the limitations imposed by missing remains. Both positions were rational within their own frameworks, yet neither could fully absorb the entire complexity of what the investigation had uncovered. This tension is what gives the case its enduring presence. It does not collapse into a simple binary of solved or unsolved. Instead, it occupies a space where multiple levels of certainty coexist without fully resolving into one another. Investigatively, the case points strongly toward a domestic origin of violence followed by deliberate concealment. Legally, it remains constrained by procedural limits that prevent absolute closure on the central charge of murder. Over time, the case has become less about Evelyn Dick as an individual and more about what her case represents within the broader history of criminal investigation and law. It represents the difficulty of translating fragmented physical evidence into complete narrative truth. It represents the way legal systems must operate within thresholds that do not always align with investigative confidence. And it represents the uncomfortable reality that some events, once altered through destruction or removal of evidence, can never be fully restored in their original form. The persistence of the case in public memory is therefore not accidental. It is structural. Humans are drawn to unresolved narratives not simply because they are dramatic, but because they expose the limits of understanding in a way that completed cases do not. A resolved case allows closure. An unresolved one forces continued engagement, continued interpretation, and continued questioning. In that sense, John Dick's case functions as both a historical record and a conceptual boundary. It marks the point where investigation becomes interpretation, and where interpretation must accept that it cannot fully replace what has been lost. It is not unique in having missing pieces, but it is distinctive in how clearly those missing pieces define the entire structure of what can be known. Even now, decades later, the case does not evolve in terms of facts. It evolves in terms of perspective. Each retelling emphasizes different aspects: forensic difficulty, legal procedure, domestic dynamics, or psychological interpretation. Yet all of them circle the same core limitation. There is no final version of the story that can eliminate the absence at its center. And perhaps that is the most important insight the case leaves behind. That truth in real-world investigation is not always a complete object waiting to be uncovered, but sometimes a partial structure that must be understood in relation to what is permanently missing. In such cases, knowledge does not end in certainty. It ends in calibrated understanding, where what is known is always defined, in part, by what can no longer be recovered. The case of John Dick remains exactly in that state. Not fully closed, not actively open, but permanently situated in the space between. A space where evidence is strong enough to suggest direction, but not complete enough to eliminate doubt entirely. A space where history records what was found, but cannot restore what was taken away. And in that space, the case continues to exist, not as a conclusion, but as a lasting reminder that some truths are not meant to be fully completed, only carefully approached, and then left exactly where certainty can no longer reach them.